Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Perception and Action Journal Club. So today I'm joined by Sam and Kathy, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a second. Today we're going to talk about the broad issue of virtual reality VR training, mostly about sports. We might dabble in a little bit of other areas too. Talk about kind of some of the research in the area and some of the technology and adoption of it. So we have two of the leading people, I would say, that are in that realm. So I'm really happy to have them. So I will let I'll go order of my screen. So I'll let maybe Sam, can you maybe introduce yourself? Both of you have been interview guests on the podcast before, so I'll let you, if you can introduce yourself, a little bit about your background and what you work on.
Of course. So yeah, I'm Sam. I did my PhD at University of Exeter in 2010, and I have stayed there ever since. So I'm now an associate professor, and I work alongside Mark Wilson, David Harris, Gavin Buckingham, who are, I think, regular watchers of the podcast. So my initial work was in quiet eye and quiet eye training, doing my PhD. That evolved into some other stuff around sort of stress inoculation, independent stress responses and things. And then evolved more recently into the field of simulation training, but more specifically virtual reality training. Just before we went live, we were talking a little bit about skepticism of VR training, and that was the origin of my interests. And perhaps what I want to talk about today is how that's evolved now into less skepticism, more optimism, all based on the fact that there's some really cool stuff being published in the space of VR and VR training. So I also, alongside the research group, which is Virtual Immersive Training and Learning, we worked from the acronym VITAL and found words that fit it. So from the research group, there was also a spin-out organization, Cineon Training, who build virtual reality tools for non-sporting industries, actually, for oil and nuclear and medical training. So all of that sort of, all of those people all come together to propose research questions, develop VR tools, and there's this kind of nice cycle of building, designing, testing, building, designing, testing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay. Well, lots of things we'll come back to there, but now we'll go to Kathy.
Yeah. Hi, yes, I'm Professor Kathy Craig. I'm a Professor of Experimental Psychology at Ulster University, but I'm also CEO and founder of another startup that sort of uses immersive technologies really to help people move better. So a lot of that, of course, is related to sport, but also things to do with health and well-being as well. So how did I get into that? PhD, undergraduate and PhD actually at the University of Edinburgh. So of course, Rob is very well known for his Perception Action podcasts. I grew up with Perception Action. I was lucky enough to have Professor David Lee as my PhD supervisor. David Lee was actually a postdoc with Gibson, so that's my claim to fame.
Nice tree.
So I had an absolute honour to be supervised by Dave. He inspired me a lot. He taught me to think about how we move, why we move, and why sometimes we can't. How does the brain control movement, the role of information, how information guides movement. After my PhD, I mean, again, very serendipitously, ended up in Marseille to work with Reinout Boetsma there on an 8-month contract, ended up staying 8 years. So had a brilliant time there. That's where actually I discovered virtual reality. So I must admit with Dave is very much focused on observational of behavior, measuring movement, not necessarily experimental control. So I was delighted to discover the VR technology in Marseille. At the time, we had Gilles Montagne, Michel Laurent, and Aymar de Rugy using a big screen with a treadmill in front of it and looking at walking through apertures and how you regulate gait as different apertures approached. I worked with Reinout looking at time to passage. So again, using the power of VR to simulate different types of looming. But then I also, at the time, the World Cup was on in Marseille. You had more footballers and soccer players doing curve-free kicks. And I had a very simple question really around why do players, A, bend the ball? And is it more difficult for a goalkeeper to judge where that ball's going to go? Because to make a save, you're going to have to anticipate where the ball's going to go to get to the right place at the right time. So to cut a long story short, I was looking for a technology that would allow me to simulate that so I could actually control the level of spin, but then measure realistically what the player was going to do. But very importantly, make sure that that player was active in the perceptual process so they could choose where they would pick up the information. So a very rudimentary headset back in 2000, Cybermind headset from the Netherlands, cost $10,000 at the time, had a flock of birds tracker at the back. You couldn't move. You could turn your head left and right. 360-degree immersion was the height of it. And responses were recorded simply on a mouse. Now, at that time, that was revolutionary compared to like caves that cost like $500,000 to make and to have. So basically, lucky enough that Adidas Innovation Team Football were there at the time. They were very interested in the research because they made soccer boots that allowed you to put more spin on the ball. So I had a fantastic time taking my little headset with the flock of birds around the top soccer clubs in Europe, got stopped at the airports, tested as if it was like a bomb because I had like the flock of birds case, but had a brilliant time, able to test perception only, not really able to couple it to action. So when I moved to Belfast in 2006, they were very generous at Queen's University. I got a really nice lab, copied what they did in the Venn lab, what Bill Warren did with the InterSense system, so that I could start to couple perception and action, because I was not able really to show expertise in perception only experiments for the soccer. But when I was able to couple perception to action, I was able to start to see what do the experts do differently when they're confronted with these scenarios. And for me, that then became the crux of a lot of things I've done since, where action is the manifestation of a decision. And through the analysis of the action, you're able to understand what the player's thinking about what's going to happen next. So used VR then again in soccer, looked at that in more detail, rugby, cricket, handball, also then with things like Parkinson's as well, how we could cue gates. So many applications. Why? Because for me, virtual reality gives you the opportunity to control what the brain sees and measure how the brain responds.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really, I don't know if I've ever talked about this. That's kind of how I got started too. I think I started in 1999. I started.
We started about the same time. So I remember seeing your baseball stuff at ICPA, I think. In Toronto, possibly.
Yeah. So what's that?
Tell you, I was 14 years old in 19.
I knew you were going to show our age, and you child.
Because I learned on my PhD, I learned how to control the information, the visual information, and control that. But I wanted it coupled. Yeah. The only way I saw to do it, I never thought of VR as a training tool at that point. It was a way, if I had a way to measure the stimulus, like a ball moving the way we can in baseball now, I probably never would have gone into VR at that time. But you just you couldn't quantify the stimulus and have it coupled. And so mine was, we had a flock of birds too in the lab, and I played around after hours and kind of got it to connect to a game of, it was basically a game of Pong on the computer. So you could I got it so you could move your hand to play the game of Pong. And I almost cried because I was like coupling. it was pretty funny. So, but yeah, so I don't know where we want to start exactly. So we talked a little bit about maybe the issue, kind of the acceptance and some of the issues now. So I know you've been working a lot on, I've seen some of the traditional issues that people have worried about, like things like the depth perception issues, the distortions of perceptual space, as well as some of the other things. So what are some of the what are the skepticisms you started with in Sam and some of the work you've done on it? Yeah.
The backstory, if you like, about simulation, I really enjoyed hearing them from both of you. And my story is slightly different in that it was actually these huge kind of physical simulation installations that we started working with in military contexts. So Mark Wilson and I were doing lots of work in marksmanship training that would involve these huge installations of projections and decommissioned weapons and things being put together. And I could never get very excited about simulation because those things were expensive. Same with the aviation research. We were doing work with pilots. But the prospect of a £60 million simulator was it wasn't possible. 10,000 sounds more appealing, Kathy. But when the head-mounted stuff came about, it felt like an opportunity to do all the things that you guys have described and were already doing. But we realized quite quickly there were lots of things that needed consideration, that needed experimentation, but more importantly, in the first phases, that needed some kind of system applied to them. And I mean that in kind of conceptual terms. So some kind of framework that would allow overseeing of that. And that's the same time that we were thinking those things. We were getting emails to ask to review Rob's thinking on that as well. So it's always nice when got an idea and then it appears elsewhere. But what we hadn't really realized at that stage is all the things Rob just talked about, which is all of the perceptual challenges that head-mounted VR was going to generate, as well as the opportunities. But the challenges it would create from the perspective of somebody that was interested in quite specific visual behaviors and the measurement of those visual behaviors within virtual environments. And so we explored those, and this became a big feature of the fellowship of David Harris. So David is a Royal Academy of Engineering fellow, and the first project that he essentially undertook was to review some of those kind of perceptual property challenges and write a kind of small review paper. And that became the initial focus. And I think it was early 2019. Where are we now? Yeah, 2020. So at the ESAN meeting of 2019, Expertise Skill Acquisition Network meeting, I gave a talk there about the limitations and the challenges of VR. And David's paper was sort of entitled, virtually the same, questioning the perceptual properties of VR versus the real world. But from that has then spawned a whole load of questions around more practical questions around the adoption of VR for training. It's interesting what you said earlier, Rob, that you never considered VR as a training tool. But what I think I've learned over the last few years is that every measurement tool eventually becomes a training tool in some way. Kind of the evolution of a measurement tool into a training tool. And then the work took a kind of different direction with Cineon, because it became less about the perceptual stuff and more about sort of procedural learning and overcoming practical challenges of training. So the work that's done there in oil and nuclear is more about opportunity and the economics of training, reducing and improving those. But we've recently revisited VR training in the sports context and tried to sort of put our money where our mouth is and actually do some real experimentation. And what I've been interested to find is that the data that we've generated are far more supportive of the potential benefits and the efficacy of VR training than I had imagined. Mm-hmm. So those that were at the talk in March of 2019 probably thought that I was a complete skeptic and had no interest whatsoever. But I'm pleased to say within 12 months, I've started to change that view. And you probably seen the paper published by Greg Wood in testing a football simulation. Mm-hmm. And that was really the beginning of that process, where very straightforward methodology, nothing particularly groundbreaking, but really nice data to show that a simulator that's designed to replicate simple football drills was distinguishing really expert people from less expert people and entire novices. And so I started to really listen at that point and take interest in why that's happening, what these things are doing, what that might mean for training.
Yeah. What about you, Kathy? Did you kind of did you always see it as a training opportunity or?
No,
or
for
did
me,
you
it's very like you, Rob. For me, it was for research, and I didn't see it as a training opportunity because for me, the technology wasn't there. It wasn't cheap enough. It wasn't portable. I could never see how anybody could use it. And I suppose one of the turning points for me was ECSS in 2016 in Vienna. I gave a talk there on the VR technology. The room was packed out, and at the end I was bombarded by questions, and I was just presenting the research, and I had Ralph Brandon from the English Cricket Board come up to me, performance director, going, right, Kathy, so basically I presented cricket that we had done with the Australian Institute of Sport. So he was gutted about that for a start. But that's because I'd approached the ECB and they weren't interested. So I knew Damien Farrell. He got me into the AIS. We got what we needed. Ash Dwan, who was an Indian PhD student, mad about cricket. We did what we could do then. That was very basic, but there was some potential there. Put it like this, it was a hell of a lot better than Pro Batter, which was a combination of video that didn't correspond to the kinematics of the ball actually was launched from a ball machine in behind. So you basically a video of a bowler coming up, releasing a ball, a hole in the screen where a ball was released afterwards from a bowling machine. And I was like, what the hell are you doing? You're decoupling your perception with the resulting trajectory that comes from that. So if you're trying to train advanced cues, you're actually doing more harm than good. And this is back to my point of why have I done what I've done? I actually saw some companies creep into this space. I'll not name them, but there's one company that uses 360-degree video VR, and they were working with your US ski team. And what they were doing is they had somebody looking as if they were descending a ski, the slalom slope, but that was recorded with somebody with a camera. It was not that person's own motion going down the slope. So the ego perception was totally different from if that person was skiing themselves. Then they put them on planks of wood because they thought, oh, the action, they have to be able to edge. They weren't even proper skis. So they were on these planks of wood. They could edge, but their action didn't change the perception. So you decoupled perception and action. And I was thinking, what are you doing? And in fact, Lindsay Vaughan had probably one of her worst Olympics. And in fact, I remember a quote with her where she said, I was coming down the slope and I hit that corner much quicker than I thought. And therefore I wasn't prepared. So if you have trained somebody to go down a slope at a speed that's less than what they would descend, you're actually doing a lot of harm. So that was my own personal frustration at people using VR in the wrong way. So when people say, can VR be used for training? Absolutely it can. VR isn't what it's about. It's about the content of the VR. To me, it's like saying, can you use television? Can you use video to train? Yes, of course you can. It's about the content, and it's not simulation for simulation's sake. And I've worked with a lot of engineers in the past, and I think this is the danger. I've worked with engineers who think, let's do tennis. And I'm like, why? What's your question? And all my research has been very specific around certain tasks. Why are we doing goalkeeping and soccer? Because it's a really good task, right place, right time. Reading ball trajectories, anticipating, getting your hands to the right place at the right time. Are we very confident in our simulator about post-ball contact? Do we have the fingers absolutely simulated at this moment in time? No, we don't. Sam, you talked about another company that's doing a simulator for soccer drills. I do worry about that because you don't have the proprioceptive feedback of the ball on the foot. And this is, again, back to the limitations. I think we have to, when we're doing training, appreciate what have we got? Is 90% of the sensory input good enough to train what we need to train? And what is it we're trying to train, and what are we trying to improve? If for my goalkeeping, I was saying I was trying to improve the finest margins of technique in an elite goalkeeper when they're trying to catch the ball, I would say, no, that's not what our simulator clean sheet is designed to do. What it's designed to do is about reading trajectories. It's about the decision making in what, when, how. What do you do? When do you do it? And how do you do it? Up to the point of ball contact. Then we have to be very mindful and careful about what are the limitations and what we can do. But then the other side is what currently exists in sports technology. Very, very, very little that tells you anything about context-driven decisions about action. GPS means nothing when you come to understand performance. You might as well look at heart rate to tell you something about load on the player. GPS is going to tell you how many miles they ran. And we know the likes of Messi, Ronaldo, all of them actually run less when they're better because they don't lose the ball. They actually time their runs. So, you know, as a metric of performance, it's no good, but we know everybody buys it. So part of my personal frustration and what pushed me to start my own company to do this was I saw people going into this space who haven't done the research, don't know the limitations. And number two, lots of gadgets out there that people are using to try to measure performance. In fact, the company I know locally that makes GPS actually would tell coaches they could use that data to select players. That's dangerous, you know. So I think as scientists, we have a responsibility to educate people about what is performance. And I think, Sam, you mentioned the data as well, and Rob, you did as well. That for me is the key thing. What is the data we can get from this technology, and what does it tell us about performance and how you can improve it? So for me, it's not about saying, here, do clean sheet and you'll save more goals. It's why do you save more goals? And I can show you later the analytics we have that goes into the what do you do, when do you do it, and how do you do it. That then explains why you save more goals.
Yeah.
I completely, sorry, Rob.
Go ahead,
I share Kathy's view there on what the what the potential limitations are, and the viewpoint that skeptical viewpoint that we should take of particularly head-mounted VR. But I think what we did a couple of years back was to stand back and try to really identify what the matrix of different factors are that you need to think about in order to make a judgment, an objective judgment about a particular VR simulation tool. Because there are many, and sometimes we get hung up on the wrong ones. So there are the problems that Kathy described really well a moment ago around the ability to actually generate the perceptual information properly. So VR tennis is a great one.
Mm-hmm.
I think it very unlikely that we would ever create one that is going to train those perceptual skills very well. But we also found ourselves stumbling upon really practical, really quite silly hurdles. Like, why would we need a football passing VR simulator when a football costs £9 in the UK and a piece of grass and another person is all you really need to drill those skills? So there are also those practical limitations. But the paper that David published a year or so ago tried to provide that matrix in as much detail as we possibly could. But we were borrowing there a lot from a whole load of really good previous work that had already been done, and in many ways, just bringing those different factors together. But we were conscious of having too much of an independent sort of subjective view of a tool, and needing to actually empirically test it and objectively study it in order to come to a decision. And so then the football passing simulator comes back into play here, because actually the distinction that Greg Wood showed in his paper is really quite compelling. So there is something about that simulator that expertise is leaning on or is related to, because it distinguishes people really clearly. So we still don't know why, or we don't know what it is, and certainly the lack of
why. You should know why. That's the point. And I think it's back to the metrics again, and it's back to how are you measuring expertise. And I see a lot of these simulators are using reaction time. Two very important studies we have done both in football and soccer, I'll say, and rugby have shown that expertise is not defined by moving as quickly as possible. They actually wait longer, particularly in deceptive scenarios, in scenarios where the ball's bending or there's curved free kicks, or in rugby, if somebody's trying to step you, they actually wait longer. They can pick up more information. And this is where action capabilities come in, because decision-making and those decisions about what you do next is not simply the perceptual information. It's also your ability to act on it. So you've got detecting information, action capabilities. And if you can move faster, move in a more skilled way, you've got more time on the ball. And we often hear that phrase, more time on the ball. And what people ignore is that interaction between skill and decision-making. I always give the analogy of tennis again. I'm crap at backhand. So instead of playing backhand, I will decide to try and play a forehand because I know my backhand's weak. So I'm actually being influenced in my decisions through my skill set. And we've seen this in rugby when we've been using the VR. I've had the Ulster Rugby come to me, professional rugby team here in Belfast, injured players, didn't know what really to do with these players. They were bored off their heads. They were out for a year and they wanted to bring them back and make them more sharp. One of them plays out half, so a very critical decision-making position, where they have to get the ball and make that decision quite quickly. But you have to be able to recreate those special temporal constraints in which you make a decision. In rugby, you've got a fleeting moment of opportunity to make that pass and then it's gone. And what I found with that player was one of their players, I had created a little task. A third of the responses should have been passed to the left, a third should have been run straight ahead, and a third should have been to the right, because that's where the gaps opened in the defensive line. So what I did was I just gave him this, randomized them all. And at the end, just when the results came up at the end of the thing, he had 70% passes to his left. Now in rugby, when you pass to your left, you're passing off your right hand. So if you're right hand, it's your dominant pass, and you can usually pass the ball better when it's in that direction. He had 20% run straight ahead and only 10% to his right, which meant passing off his left hand. What had happened while he was injured was he had regressed back into, I suppose, a prescriptive sort of pattern of movement, and he had lost confidence to pass off his left hand. So even though gaps were opening up on his right-hand side, his decisions about what to do regressed back to what he felt more comfortable with. So for me, that was a really interesting use of the technology. And Sam, you're 100% right. I think with VR, we have to ask the first question is, are we adding value? If we can buy a ball and go kick around with our friends, why use VR? So I'm very, very, very clear with Clean Sheet. It's where do we add value? I say this never replaces training on the pitch. But when I go and watch them train on the pitch, it's the coach kicking the ball to them. They want free kick practice. They have to bring a wall and then they put up their mannequins. Nobody's moving. Then they have to bring an outfield player over to give the kick. They know what that player's going to kick like. That's all the practice they do. Where do they get the opportunities to practice against a particular type of style of kick that they've never seen before? Where did they get those mental reps? Where did they get the opportunities to do it? Some of the kids we've worked with here, I would give them 20 free kicks and they went, Kathy, I've never faced 20 free kicks before. The other thing we've been able to do with them is dive practice. Diving is really fascinating because it really is about timing. Once you're in the air, there's nothing you can do about getting to the right place at the right time. So it's about timing that lift off the ground. How can you get kids to be able to do that? And a function we have created in Clean Sheet that as a psychologist, I put my hand up and say, I never thought this would work. We've got a redo function. So you can take exactly the same kick again. And I would be the first to say, but that doesn't happen in sport. But from a perception action perspective, if you want to strengthen that coupling, you need to be able to do it again and again and again. One kid took 7 goes to get the same kick that he had seen 6 times before, but you should have seen the joy on his face when he was able to get it. So for me, it's understanding what is this learning? What is this repetition? And a lot about it is this repetition. It is this strengthening it. Neurons that fire together, wire together. We've known that for almost 100 years, or for 80 years we've known that. This is a prime opportunity to do it. And particularly for perception action point of view, this is something we don't do enough of. We tend to think, oh, they've done it once, that's enough. No, it's not. How do you learn? You need to have that feeling of the information movement coupling coming together. VR is perfect for that.
Yeah. No, I think those are really good. I think we're really good points. And I think I'm going to follow on that in a second, the evaluation and what we should looking for. And I think the value added has always been a big one for me. The VR is not trying to replace the real thing. It can't. And I had a great example this past fall. I went to a couple of baseball meetings, and the first one I was at, they had a VR from a VR company demoing a batting simulator. I'll remain nameless. All their efforts were clearly put into making the picture look good and all the imagery look great. And the way they sold it was this could replace batting practice. And I watched people players go up, and they would look at it and they're like, no, this is not the real thing. No. The next meeting I was at, Dave Mann from Amsterdam, was there with his colleagues. Yeah. Dave has an adequate simulator that he spent all the time putting into being able to analyze how well batters can follow the ball with their eyes and immediately visualize it based on different pitches, order. And he was showing this to the players and coaches, and they're like, oh, that's useful, right? That's something I can't do in real batting practice.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So I think we're getting into, and I know, Sam, you guys wrote a paper on this, that we're getting into the issue of fidelity, right? What's the evaluation criteria? If you're a manager or coach going to buy a simulator, what are you looking for? So do you want to dive into that a little bit, Sam?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I will say actually the only positive part of my 2019 ESAM talk was actually a discussion, Rob, about your paper. In which you describe adaptive VR as being the really useful mechanism for VR in baseball. And yeah, I'll talk a bit more about how that's how that's evolved in some of our work. But yeah, the fidelity paper is interesting because we started to describe earlier. We started generating this matrix of different fidelity and validity factors that we thought would be at play. And it was about 180,000 factors long at one point. It was ridiculous how many categories we could determine that fidelity could fit into. And so we went through a process of actually tweeting about them to try and get feedback on which ones different coaches and different manufacturers thought were relevant. And then slowly over time, David worked to try and generate a matrix that we thought was relevant. So we've got, on one side, we've got fidelity with a series of different physical, ergonomic, psychological, and affective factors. And I won't go into too much detail on all of those, but there are reasons for each of those that relate to the different types of simulations that we want this framework to be relevant to. So this doesn't just include sports simulation. This might include simulation for kind of clinical reasons in terms of psychological therapy. It might be simulations of kind of complicated human interaction processes in the military, for example. So physical, ergonomic, psychological, and affective fidelity. But we tried to build in some of these other practical things that we've been talking about here, but give them clever names so that we can publish them. Exactly what Kathy described earlier about just added value, about the relative expectations of the person that was picking up the simulation. Were they trying to replace something? Were they trying to add something extra? And then also looking at simulation and head-mounted VR as often being a part of a wider curriculum of some kind. So I use the phrase curriculum here because it's not just sport, but thinking about the practicalities of where this slots into the day-to-day kind of teaching and learning of whoever's using simulation. Yeah, and trying to bring those together in a clever way, and really just leaning on all the good work that's already been done in that area, so that there is almost a one-stop shop for people to go, well, I think we need to consider this type of fidelity. This is really important. My view still is that the most important of those factors is the psychological fidelity, the idea that we are generating a simulation that's going to adopt the same psychological processes, let's call them for simplicity's term, same psychological processes, particularly perceptual processes, as the real world. And I think psychological fidelity is arguably the most important for sports simulations in particular. We need people to behave and think and be cognitively as they would be in the real world. Otherwise, what's the point? And often, as Kathy said earlier, you can do more harm than good, perhaps. But alongside that is this kind of hybrid of physical and ergonomic fidelity, because because sport is about perception and action, simulators need to also consider the way in which the skill feels in the simulator and the way in which it's performed. But kind of what my view was at the time was that anything that is too much about feel, hitting a baseball, kicking a football, we're always going to struggle to make a simulation that's going to be really, really high fidelity. But if we actually get all the other bits right, all the other fidelity factors spot on, then maybe you can overcome that limitation. And I think some of the simulations that we've been testing in the lab in the last year or so, football and golf, very much about feel, but yet still the other fidelity factors have been spot on. And therefore, there seems to be some data emerging that these simulations do have a use somewhere. Does that cover what you were sort of thinking, Rob?
Yeah, exactly. The psychological versus kind of physical. There's been obsession with physical fidelity, I think, in simulators. How good they look, the images, the stereo, how good's the stereo. Whereas I think we all agree, and I think Kathy, I'm sure the same. I think you would focus more on kind of the information movement relationships, right? I would see. What I've seen is you've carefully chosen your tasks over the years, because the ones that you thought you could maintain that, right?
Absolutely. And I don't think it's for everything. And again, I sort of alluded to it earlier. I work very closely with the group at the University of Rennes. Great guys. But they were real geeks and they were real engineers, just no disrespect to them. They wanted to simulate everything for simulation's sake, just to show that it could be done. And I kept saying, no, guys, no. And then they were very keen on Mel Slater's work and all his work around levels of presence. And I kept saying to them, that's fine. I looked at the presence questionnaire. I was never happy with it. I suppose I came up with my own solution, which was behavioural realism. Do you behave in the virtual world as you do in the real world? If you do, you're going to have transfer. So, you know, I get asked this question so many times. Oh, yes, can you show me the study that proves performance improves in your when they do clean sheet? And I said, no, I'm not going to do that, because number one, I'm a scientist and I can't produce that type of data for you, because number one, I am not going to tell the goalkeepers I'm working with to stop all their other training and do only my simulator. I'm not going to control it like that. All I have to go is show you what I have. And it's back to what we talked about earlier. What is the data we can get to allow us to understand performance from a simulator that we can't get in real life? So I'll say to the coaches, right, okay, so you've watched player X. What's great about them? Oh, their footwork's pretty good. Okay, how do you know that? Oh, I just can see it. So I said, well, let me show you some of their data here. And I can capture number of steps. I can look at speed of movement. I can do all of these things. And I can show them metrics that support what they see. One of the guys, a Canadian kid, came in and he did one of our tests. So this is back again, Sam, to what we were talking about earlier. Where do you add value? And I think, what can you do with a simulator that you can't do in real life, particularly for sports? You're trying to decide who's the best player. If you want to do this in a scientific way, you need to give them all exactly the same input. How do you do that in real life? You can't. Even your best footballer can't give the same kick every time. I can do it in clean sheet. I can set up a test where, in fact, I can do even better. I can give you exactly the same shot on your left-hand side as on your right-hand side. So I can actually then check for biases in your responses. So this little kid that came from Canada, he's not a little kid, he's a young guy, and he plays for a local club here. Very keen to do better. So he did it, and I looked at his data immediately afterwards on the dashboard, and we look at how many shots were saved with left hand, right hand, both hands, which body part, etc., etc. You see the distribution of shots across the goal. And anyway, I said to him, Daniele, are you left-handed? And he went, how did you know that? And I said, check out your data. I said, you've saved 65% of the shots with your left hand. And me just eyeballing immediately after he did the test, I was able to say you have a bias in your response. And the ones he missed were on his right-hand side. So anyway, what did we do? He wanted to come back a week. I said, that's fine. You carry on training with Michael. You carry on doing your games, but let's work on your left-hand side. What did we do? We started to give him so many shots to his right-hand side. So we started to train his weak side. We started to give many more things, varied everything up. And then 8 weeks later, I gave him exactly the same test again. He hadn't seen it before then. I randomized it again, so he didn't know which shot was coming. What did I notice? He made 10% more saves than he did the first time. But what my question was, okay, that's fine. I wasn't saying, oh, great, super, he made more saves. Why did he make more saves? When I looked at his hand bias, it had reduced. And the other thing that was really interesting was his movement efficiency had increased. What's your movement efficiency? It's essentially your perception action coupling. If a ball comes here and you move directly to intercept that ball and you take the shortest route, you're 100% efficient. So these are metrics that we're trying to bring in that are trying to, I suppose, quantify performance and show where that elite performance really is. That's what I was really excited about. It's not that I could tell he did 10% more saves. I was able to say why, and that's what I think is really interesting, Sam. What is that behavioural data we can get out? Behavioural realism, trying to capture and quantify performance in these scenarios, something we can't do in everyday life. We don't have sensors in the ball. We don't have sensors in the hand and the feet and that. We could digitize it, but it's a hell of a task. We can't give them exactly the same shots again. Let's use the technology where it adds value and do things we can't do. You can't do that in everyday life. It's really exciting. So let's just play on that.
Yeah. No, I think those are great points. And I kind of look for the same thing. I want the relationship between information and how you move to be similar to the real thing. And I point out there's lots of real training that violates that, right? In baseball, we have people hit off batting machines.
Yes,
that throw the same speed every time. Ball comes out, a shoot you can see, and it even makes a thunk sound. All those sources of information are not going to be there when you hit a real pitch. So you're training with, you're breaking this relationship. And I like, yeah.
You've got exactly the same problem in cricket. You get very good batters who bat against a bowling machine. And they're good at batting against a bowling machine. And where's the transfer then?
Yeah. Yeah. And I like, Sam, you've moved it also into, do you get similar gaze behavior? Do you get similar that I think that's all part and parcel of the same thing. Got a question, maybe what you guys can answer. It's regarding the latest and greatest in tactile, the gloves. I'm not as up to date on the newest things. Kathy, what are your
I'll answer this because
Yeah.
yes, I mean, this is a very interesting question. So this is why I put my psychologist hat on, and I would have taught perception for a long time at university. So if you think of the difference between, so we talked earlier about proprioception, we talked earlier about tactile type feedback, and it is the most difficult thing to simulate. Proprioception, no. So I'll explain a little bit about what we've done for the goalkeeping. So the very first time I tried to look at perception, action, coupling and goalkeeper, where I wanted somebody to physically move to stop a virtual ball, I brought the guys in, this was in Belfast, put the headset on them and said to them, okay, can you stop these balls? And they took the headset immediately off and looked at me and goes, I can't see my hands, because, okay, they had their hands in the real life, but they hadn't animations of their hands in the same task space as where the ball was. So the next step was to animate virtual hands in that same task space as the ball. So the ball's coming towards you, the virtual hands are there that you control, and you stop. Now, what's really important there is when you see your virtual hands in Clean Sheet or in this old simulator we had, when you do this, you see your hands turn. So the visual system's saying, oh, my hands are moving. And then proprioceptively, you know you're rotating those. So you get that buy-in from the brain. It's a bit like the rubber hand illusion, all those different types of things. So proprioception and vision are coherent and they're talking together. Tactile, slightly different, because that's really that feedback to tell you that you've made contact with an object. We've tried it in cricket. We've worked with some of the gloves for the Clean Sheet as well. Now for finger movements, it's probably a little bit better, and even the HTC Vive trackers, you get like a buzz. So you are not simulating the fidelity, back to fidelity again, of what you need to really have the brain buy-in. What happens? You get a startled response. You go, oh, what was that? What have we decided to do? Tactile information, touch is a direct sense. So you have to be in contact with the source to be able to feel it. Vision and sound are indirect senses. You do not have to be in contact with the source of the stimulus to actually perceive it. Big, big, big difference. That means you can simulate that really well. The problem with the tactile is you have to then have something touch your hand. The best haptic device I ever tried was when I was in Marseille. It was a Japanese group, and I've tried to find it. It was called the Spider. And basically, they had wires attached to each finger so that when you tried to close your finger, it resisted your movement. So it was the best one that I felt you had there for that. I've tried the Ultra one. It's okay. It'll be fine for gestural control in cars, which is what they're going to do. They had tried to use it for VR, but it's not good enough. What I find is sound can be a very good substitute for tactile feedback. So for cricket and in baseball, being able to get more fidelity around the type of sound and impact. So where you hit it on the bat, the speed of your bat movement, paying more attention to that is actually much better than trying to simulate the tactile stuff. For me, the tactile stuff actually breaks the experience. It creates, as I said, that startle response. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're ever going to be there, to be honest, because it's a type of digital technology that you would need to be wearing something on your hands that can really try to simulate that. And then you're really back to just do it in real life. So when Disney have done the catching the real ball, then, you know, you have a real ball coming into your hand. Then you're like, why bother? It's back to that added value. Just throw a real ball and catch it. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. What about you, Sam? You've done a bit in golf and things like that. What have you found?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with the basic principles of what Kathy described there. I think I would just pick specifically on the question in terms of the perceptual experience. That's an important part, I think. The perceptual experience in the context of sport, the short answer is no, I don't think there have been any real steps forward recently in developing a piece of tech or hardware or usable device that really does anything better. Some of the cool things I have seen outside of sport, though, have enhanced what I would call the kind of the holistic experience of the virtual simulation. So some of these have been the use of kind of external tactile resources, so sonar and things, where you have a sort of spatially directed sonar that gives you a very, very, very low-level sense of touch as you are maybe holding door handles or touching buttons in virtual worlds or picking up objects. Now, as an individual experience, they're pretty rubbish. They don't really feel anything like a door handle or a cup. But throughout the process of an entire virtual experience, a training experience, it's just another one of those factors that adds to the broader fidelity and allows that sense of immersion to kind of develop. So in the context of sport and perceptual cues, I don't think there's anything I've seen. I know Gavin Buckingham at Exeter would really love to answer this question because he's had a whole load of different kind of gloves and things sent to his lab to test out, and because his work is on kind of tactile picking up of objects and things. Yeah, I've not seen anything that I think is particularly advanced our way of doing sports related stuff, particularly if you get to the very kind of the very detailed end of the spectrum and look at things like grip aperture for holding rackets or bats, the sensation of how you grip something, as well as the way you grip objects like balls. But as I say, I think that the broader simulation world of head-mounted VR is developing a holistic experience of including sound, as Kathy said, and then a build-up of very low-level tactile proprioceptive experiences that just develop into a more immersive experience. But I think we'd ever get to the stage where we have a glove that would ever be same way we won't get visual perception that will be as good and as accurate as the real world. Will we ever get a physical sensation that's as good as the real world?
Yeah, no, I think those great points. I had the same experience. So my baseball one, I first thing I tried to do is what you described, Kathy. I just put one vibration that happened when you hit the ball. It was always the same. I thought that's all you need, but it didn't really. What I ended up doing is I strapped a whole bunch of motors to the vibration, and then people held it by a cable, and so it actually vibrate differently depending on whether you hit the sweet spot or not. If you hit the sweet spot, it would hardly vibrate at all. If you hit it near the handle, it would vibrate a lot. That would give some, because you started to get some information from tactile. Yeah. It was very different, but you're right. It is a very difficult thing to simulate, and I don't know. Keep thinking we're edging closer, but I don't know if we'll ever get there. Yeah.
There is the Tesla suit, but I mean, it's was designed as a gaming suit where you could actually feel impact on your actual body. So again, you have to wear this big suit, and we have thought about using it for some of our rugby stuff, but it's expensive, and I'm not quite sure it's there yet. I mean, back to what you said again, Rob, it's back to how does the sense work? How is information I suppose, transmitted, for want of a better word, or specified through that sense? So, you know, obviously with vision and sound, you've got things like looming, you've got like these gap closures. I was just thinking back when you talked about the little motors of the work we did with Lorena and David Jacobs in Madrid around, we put this haptic device around the torso. And again, we were able to use, it was almost works like a compound eye. So you had about maybe 30 different motors across the chest, each vibrating slightly differently to give that common sense of perception and orientation. And we were able to use it to locomote, to orientate, and to do stuff like that. But again, we were using it like looming. We were presenting information haptically in a different way. So again, that was more sensory substitution rather than haptic information that would really help and say in sports. So I don't think we're there yet, and I don't know how we can get there, to be honest.
Yeah. What about you? Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
I agree with Kathy's point earlier that the kind of mixed reality or the hybrid model here is pretty useless for training. So, you know, having a real ball that's then represented in the virtual world coming at you and you catch it. For training and learning, what's the point? But actually, as an experimentalist, I think that's a really, really useful setup for being able to tweak and play with and experiment with a whole range of different things. So we've looked at kind of simulated dart throwing and looked at trying to actually create this kind of mixed reality version of that, where you are throwing real darts at a real dartboard, but they are appropriately represented and accurately represented in the virtual world, so that you can then play with a whole load of different variables around the size of the objects, the perception of distance. You've essentially got a real task being performed, but you're in charge of the perceptual world that the person's doing it in. And that, I think, is really valuable from an experimental perspective. I just don't, as Kathy said, I don't see the value in that from a training and learning perspective. But maybe there is also. I mean, there are some interesting ideas that undergraduates have suggested around being able to play with the kind of spin of a ball. So the ball is coming at you, but it's spinning the opposite way to the way that it is in the real world. And do you pick up on those differences by feeling that the spin was the other way when you catch it versus the way it appeared in the visuals? But I do think there are a number of companies, I think, that are pursuing that particular way of working. I just don't know if they're going to lift that across to sport.
Yeah, no, I agree. The visuals have made a huge step, obviously, in recent years, and in terms of both quality and price. But I think I agree. The auditory information, I think, is underlooked.
Yeah, absolutely, it's something is so important. It's one of those things that anytime that we've added it in, you don't really notice it, and then what you do notice is when it's not there. So I mean, we have it for contact with the ball. We have it with the kick. So for clean sheet, when the ball's actually contacted with that, and it's such an important cue, if you want, for want of a better word, part and source of information that's really important, again, in the perception action. And again, for me, you shouldn't separate these out. Again, it's about recreating the event as realistically as possible. So, and again, it's back to what you were saying there earlier, Sam. Okay, so darts, golf, and I always make this distinction between different types of action, and it all comes down to the timing that's required to perform those actions. So golf, darts are what I call self-paced actions. You decide when and how you control the action. You are actually imparting a force to an object to send it for some sort of goal. The difference then is interceptive action, whether you're trying to intercept another player, trying to intercept a ball, trying to do something like that. That's extrinsic timing. And there the timing is dependent on what's happening and unfolding around you. So they're two very different things. So the goal-directed actions, very much more, what's important there is the perception of depth, the perception of distance, that you're trying to like impart the force up to the object to send it on. But then the other timing is very much about that information pickup that allows you to anticipate and prospectively control your action. And they're very important distinction that we sometimes, again, it's back to your classification of, and I think it's a very, very important academic exercise. It needs to be done. So I encourage you to continue with that. For people who want to use simulation, what's the type of action you want to perform? What's correct for that? Because the rules will be slightly different. It's back to where do you add value? Again, are you trying to I suppose, for want of a better word, put on prisms in the VR world and distort things slightly, look at recalibration. Again, for things like stroke and adaptation there, we talked earlier a little bit about health. We haven't even really got there yet. So for Parkinson's as well, what we were able to do there was, it's very difficult if you're trying to understand things like freezing of gait and Parkinson's. So for people who don't really know what Parkinson's is, Parkinson's disease attacks what we call the gearbox of the motor system. So the system about initiating action. So if you wanted to sort of start to walk, if you wanted to reach out to pick up a cup or something like that, that sort of self-paced action is very difficult for people with that, Parkinson's. Catching a ball, much easier, because it uses the perceptual action part of the brain. But what did we do with VR is Dorothy Cowie, actually, she created real doorways. So what we know with Parkinson's is if you approach a narrowed aperture, so if the visual information gets more constrained, it can induce this freezing. Freezing is basically when they literally can't move forward anymore. So they could be walking okay, and then they get frozen to the spot. So what we decided was actually with Lika Pepper, and she had a master's student, and he wanted to study this with VR. And we thought, well, then let's do this. Let's create a corridor and let's change the width of the doorways. And let's see if we can induce freezing in these patients with Parkinson's. Sure enough. So if you took off the headset, you're in a massive lab. You put the headset on, and again, it's about the visual information. You're able to constrain what they see and induce these changes in behavior. So we had these ladies, you would walk down the lab in the VR headset, they saw a doorway, and you see them literally freezing to the spot. And then in other conditions, back to what you were saying earlier, Sam, about that ability to control experimentally these things, other conditions without a doorway, they walk perfectly normally. There was a great example of where VR can add value. You don't have to create physical doors of different sizes to actually maybe understand medication regimes, look at other behavioral cues that you can help them to walk through the door. So we used virtual footsteps as well, where you would light up virtual footsteps that became extrinsic timing cues for them. They could couple and then improve their gait. So I think the potential of this technology is absolutely huge, and we're only touching the tip of the iceberg. So to say VR doesn't have use is nonsense.
Yeah, no, and that's kind of something I want to, I think we talked a little, the kind of the value added point. So I think we've talked about some of them already. You can standardize a environment. You can do way more trials in a shorter amount of time than is possible real. We both of you talked about, the spin examples, and it's Sam and Kathy's free kicks. You can give way more practice with a relatively rare event than you'd ever get in the real world. What are some of the others? Maybe, I don't know, even moving beyond sports, Sam, what are some of the things you think VR can add to training?
Yeah, but I'm not sure.
Broad question.
Good question. I'm not sure this has a particularly clever sounding title but situations where people might die, where there's real danger, real risk. I think that's where the value of VR has really been explored in the sort of industries that Cineon are working in. So we know that we need to expose people to the dangers, the risks, the hazards that they face in everyday life, but we've got there's literally no way of doing that in the real world. There may have been back in the 60s and 70s, but there certainly aren't anymore. So those applications have been really useful in the oil industry, in nuclear, and in medicine. And they aren't just about creating physical danger. It's often about psychological safety and psychologically challenging situations. So putting people not just kind of in hot environments or high hazardous environments, but also into psychologically demanding situations that it would be either difficult to create in the real world or unethical to create. Particularly in kind of acute decision-making situations. So if you're facing both a physical and a psychological danger, we know that behavior breaks down, decision-making breaks down. Simulation of that helps us to research it, but simulation, as we discussed earlier, naturally a research tool evolves into a training tool. So people say, well, you've told us a bit about what we do with this tool. If we were to do that again and again and again and again, would we get better at it? Okay, you probably would. So let's evolve it into a training tool. But interestingly, this is where I think we can stumble upon a situation where we have VR for VR's sake. And what I mean there is head-mounted, high-fidelity VR for VR's sake. Because on some occasions, it's important to create the visual and the psychological fidelity of situations. We want the burning oil refinery to look like it's an oil refinery. We want the humans that you're interacting with to appear like they're real people. But on some occasions, that stuff is also completely irrelevant. And actually, you can achieve the same objectives in training with a much lower fidelity product. And this is the basis of the PPE training stuff that we've been doing for the NHS in the UK in response to the COVID-19 situation. We went through an exercise in trying to work out what the right tool would be. And we actually ended up with a web-based, quite old-fashioned, frankly, training platform, because we couldn't rationalize the utilization of VR for VR's sake, particularly in a financially constrained and in a socially constrained situation where the prospect of people putting on headsets seemed quite ludicrous. So yeah, I think there's loads of really interesting applications, and another that we've been exploring at Cineon recently is around exposure therapy for phobic patients, particularly in this one project, patients who are phobic of MRI scanning. So going into the noisy kind of constrained MRI scanners. Here we've got an example of a VR where that level of fidelity is really important. So replicating the sights and the sounds of an MRI scanner is absolutely critical for that scanning therapy to work, that exposure to actually generate a better response. But I never imagined in a million years that that's what I would have been ending up doing maybe a few years ago. It's a strange journey to get to that. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, that's great. What about you, Kathy? You know, the value added, maybe what not sports, but also some of the special populations you work with. And
Yeah, so I mean, well, it actually, I suppose, traverses both. And again, for me, when I started Incisive, so that's our company, it was like, where do we start? So we started with the goalkeeping just because I knew there was something we could do there that could add value, that could allow you to do what you can't currently do in the real world. We had done stuff in rugby and cricket, as I mentioned. Now, some of the early stuff we had done in cricket with the ECB, we did lack the fidelity in our movement. What did happen in those early simulations was that people had to adapt their action to play the simulator. That's a problem. If that happens, you don't have a simulator. But recently we were approached by the Scottish Rugby Union, and they were very keen on using VR. They'd been to the States, they'd looked at various examples there, and they came back to me and they said, right, okay, we think what you're doing is the best we've seen so far. We would like to work together. What can we do? And I was very reticent about getting into sort of too much rugby stuff because it's complicated and stuff. And I could see certain drills we could do, but you could also do them in real life. But they said to me, Kathy, we have a real problem with player well-being and concussion. Concussion is the biggest risk to rugby, both on and off the pitch. And if you look at what's happening with soccer as well, dementia, all of this, and it just bothers me that the number of players who have some sort of motor degenerative disease or something, if we're all statisticians, really, you just say there's the number is just a little bit too high there. Muhammad Ali, Parkinson's, lots of different things. You know, you've got too many of these things happening. So with insults to the brain, injuries to the brain that we don't really understand, something's happening. And I know you had Sean Eagle on a few weeks ago and stuff like that. He's done fantastic stuff about perception action. And I think there's something really unique here that's going on in the brain in terms of that ability for those pathways to be functioning together. And it's back to where VR add value. You can control what the brain sees, measure how the brain responds. So for me, it's taking those principles of VR technology and then looking for those applications. We have a very exciting project with Scottish Rugby Union where we're developing it's a product called VR Hit, so virtual reality head injury tool. And it's going to allow us to look at basic functions, basic motor functions, and combine it with a bit of cognitive dual tasking. So if you look what exists for concussion at the minute, you've got cog sport, you've got impact, you've got those, but they're so cognitive based and they measure reaction times, and it doesn't tap into the motor system, doesn't tap into decision making like you would make on a pitch. So information movement coupling, they don't look at that. And then because this technology allows you to do all that, even from balance through to gait, through to interception, you can do some really cool stuff. So we're very excited about this as sort of bridging that gap between sport and health, of showing, look, okay, these are the things that sports men and women do, but look, check this out. This can tell us something about the integrity of the brain, integrity of neural function.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And the couple that I thought of that I would add related to my work is the opposite of standardization. You can add way more variability to practice, which everyone research shows is important.
Yeah.
And then sort of related to what you were saying, Sam, you can challenge people at an appropriate level. You can easily switch how fast the ball is moving. If they're struggling, you can make it slower, make it fast. So you can do, but all these things I would lump them. They're just all good principles of practice, design, and education, right? VR is not magic. It's just a tool that allows you to implement some of these things, just like any other training device.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah. So, so we're coming around to the end of the hour. So maybe I'll end asking you both any final thoughts, but maybe where you think the next steps are in this in VR training. You know, research wise, technology, anything you can think about. Kathy, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, Rob, you've just hit the nail on the head, I think, and Sam alluded to it earlier. I think it's about good practice. People say to me, oh, there's another VR technology company out there in sports. Are you not worried? I'm like, no, I'm not, because there's lots of room for lots of different companies if they're doing good work. What frustrates me, and this is what can almost spoil the party and can lead to a little bit of this, people saying VR's rubbish, VR's crap. VR isn't, it's a tool. You can't say that it is. It's a technology that's absolutely fantastic. The Oculus Quest now is cheaper than a mobile phone. And the fact that you can track movement to such a high, back to the fidelity thing, Sam, we have just finished an experiment by benchmarking it against the Qualis's motion capture system. We are sub 3 millimeter accuracy of their inside out tracking. It is phenomenal. And once they get their finger tracking better, I am excited by the hardware, the advances in hardware. That's been the big thing that's got me in there. Now what we need are good principles of design of content to use the hardware properly. And Rob, you mentioned earlier, what are we excited about Incisive? We've designed a platform that has got cloud-based data. So that means that we can have lots of people doing maybe the same. And, you know, when we look at as psychologists, we are basing theories, hypotheses, standardization on 100 or 200 people. With technology like this now that you can connect to a cloud, that you can control and standardize, you can have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of data points that can allow you to better understand behavior, expertise, performance. That's what super excites me, is we are creating a living lab now with our products and our technology, and Sam will be doing the same with his work, that will allow us to understand human performance in a way we have never been able to do before, because it always had to be done in a lab. Now that lab can be living. People can have it in their living room, in their sports center, wherever, and we can have that data to understand what's happening. Why? Because we've got context. We know what they saw, we know what they did, and we can then start to understand, we can understand how many injuries they had up to that point, how they've progressed over time, how we've maybe helped them or not helped them. That's what I think is exciting.
Yeah, no, great points. What about you, Sam? The next steps, maybe both for the field and what you have going on, kind of.
Yeah, I think I'd like to say something really exciting like Kathy did, but I'm going to be
Come on, Sam, you can.
More academic here and say that I'm quite excited about the journey through the data and really looking at the testing of VR simulations for sport in kind of new and interesting ways. And that really is a boring answer, but I think we really need to do that to keep the field moving forward. I think the innovations in technology now aren't a limiting factor anymore. I think the tech is there. And so there's a level playing field now for access to technology and access to the latest kind of advancements in that technology. But I think that the questions around whether VR works and is suitable are becoming more and more nuanced. And so we need to answer those questions in a slightly sexier, more interesting way to keep up with that. One example to give very briefly is the distinction in golf simulation between golf putting for learning in a simulator and golf putting as a warm-up tool, and how that very subtle difference leads you down two very different sort of experimental paths. And yeah, we're really looking forward to pursuing that, because that was the whole point of the creation of this kind of new research theme. Same people, same research tools, but we've given that direction because it's what we really want to pursue. What I also think is interesting is that in the current situation that the world is facing with this whole COVID-19 thing, is that we realized quite quickly that VR training is always at the mercy of the much broader kind of political and social context. So VR as a training solution has, in one sense, rocketed in popularity because of the social situation we're facing. Lots of people want to train remotely and learn remotely. But it's also plummeted in another, because the headsets that are used typically for VR aren't conducive to, passing on germs and aren't particularly hygienic. So although technology is now a level playing field, there's this new factor at play now, which is the kind of weird socio-political situation that governs what training does more than any of the research findings ever will. And I think that's where a lot of the big VR companies are able to be successful, because they exploit a niche where their particular sport or their particular task seems to have a culture of wanting VR training, and therefore they get it and they deliver good stuff. But yeah, so we stay fairly humble in that sense, because I think even though the tech is there and the evidence is evolving, VR could go out of fashion just as quickly as it came in. And we don't want that to happen, but we want to make sure that we've got the right answers to the right questions to justify VR training use on the right occasions. And I think today, Rob and Kathy have both given great examples of when it does work and why it does work. And that's the way that the research needs to keep going, to explore those a bit further.
Yeah, I think a lot of interesting points there. I agree 100%. And I think, Kathy, you're right. You being able to get out of the lab, and in response to your, Sam, I agree. challenges, but at the same time, this is a tool we could use for remote coaching. We could use for remote team sports.
Yeah. Thing,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? If
Yeah.
you've got a kid around the world, and I mean,
Yeah.
this is where I mean, again, it's back to like the technology adoption curve, Sam. And I think, don't forget this, like being in a startup, I feel I'm back at college, back at school again. I'm learning every day. But you've got the early adopters. That's where we're at. And, you know, your early adopters, then you've got your mass use, and then you've got your laggards at the end. And I think the people who get it get it. And I have had fantastic chats with the likes of Javi Garcia, who was the coach there at Arsenal, the goalkeeping coach for a long time, and Franz Hoek, who's basically was Louis van Gaal's right-hand man. I at Baltimore at the United Soccer Coaches Convention, we had a very robust discussion at the start around the value of this technology. He's now my number one fan. He sees the potential. And he introduced me to so many other federations, other clubs, everything. And we're about to ship to a Premiership goalkeeper tomorrow, the kit, who's in isolation and is dying to have that sensation of being able to move to intercept a virtual ball. So I think there's huge opportunity. If anything, this current crisis, which is awful for everybody, should show the importance of digital, virtual, whatever, that you don't need to be in the real, where you can still practice without another 22 people on the pitch or your coach there. You can still have those scenarios created for you. And again, it's back, Rob, you mentioned it as well, that flexibility and content. And I'd love to do it another time if you have time, Rob, to show what can we do with Clean Sheet. And it's back to that versatility, variability. If we want to practice, you need variability. And again, it's that ability to manipulate task constraints if we want to look at it as an ecological dynamics type example there as well.
Yeah. And I know the other thing, we mentioned it, touched on it a little bit, but I know Sam started to do it. I've tried to do it, the transfer issue. Although transfer research is incredibly difficult, there's lots of I think we can do some. And the initial indications are it is way better. You do, as long as you do it right, you can get show transfers. But that is a challenging thing.
It's a very hard nut to crack, Rob. And I sort of feel that you're held to a standard that nothing else is held to. Because you mentioned it earlier, which sports drills that a coach ever uses on the pitch have been scientifically proven to improve performance? Not a single one.
Yeah.
What other technology do they use has been shown to scientifically improve performance? None.
Yeah.
So it's about that question, how do you add value? We also have another feature in Clean Sheet called replay. Now, what this does is you take on the body of an avatar. You see your hands, you can look down, see your feet, but maybe you've done a shot. The coach can say, right, have a look at yourself. Replay function. You can step out of your body and see what you just did. And they just went, oh my God. So suddenly you can convey to the player, that's what you just did. Look, because again, it's about that understanding of, it's trying to understand learning. What is it that helps learning? And it's that augmented feedback and that additional information we don't currently have. That's where I say we're helping. It's not about the physical sort of like VR digital world. It's about what you can do there. It's back to the reps, back to the data, back to the augmented feedback.
Yeah. Sam, did you?
Yeah, just to say that in one of our papers that's coming up soon in golf putting, David Harris found some really nice references to essentially some pharmaceutical work where they were discussing how they design and adopt control groups, and this phrase that he coined from the paper, which was about causal contrast. What is it that you contrast the treatment that you're trying to give against in order to be sure that you have an interesting effect? And we came to the conclusion that actually the strongest argument is just doing it in the real world, in whatever form it's being done. So does VR training work in comparison to just simply doing it in the real world? And it fascinated me that actually this has even been debated, because that's the obvious one. We don't need to have an experiment with 7 different types of control group in order to control for exposure to digital content, exposure to haptic feedback. We just need to say, this is what they do in practice. So in golf putting, you stand on a green somewhere and you might hit the ball towards the hole from several different angles, several different distances. And that's training for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So we build that in VR, see if it does the same and test it. And the data is quite compelling. It shows that the virtual stuff can be just as useful over as few as 40 putts of learning in generating a bit of transfer to real world putting. And certainly a year ago, I wouldn't have believed that finding. So it's been a real breakthrough for me to.
You're a convert, Sam. There you go.
Yeah. No, I had an argument with someone about this, very related. But the burden of proof is on both sides, right? Just because you've dribbled around cones for 50 years doesn't mean it's effective. It's about relative effectiveness. We learn no matter what we do, like including nothing, right? So it's a relative benefit of training. Yeah.
And arguably, Rob, that was the alternative explanation of our findings, was that actually both of the groups just got better because they magically did, like some people do.
Yeah.
We didn't write it quite that way, but rather than controlling for the difference between these two interventions, it was entirely possible that both groups got better despite the training they were getting, the real world. So but that's a nice breakthrough for me. That methodological change, if that comes, we can accept that there is a standardized design for looking at randomized controlled trials of VR. Once we all agree on that, then we can really start to push out work that will flood the empirical database, if you like, and then we can start to really answer the question that the sporting organizations ask us regularly, and that the medical training organizations ask us regularly: does VR work? Well, we need to agree a method, run a load of studies, and then we can start to look at it in a bit more detail. And that's not to say that there aren't already lots of really good studies out there, but I think there's room for more.
Yeah. And I think, as scientists, we're trained to be cautious about predicting things in a hypothesis. But if we follow the rules like we've talked about, you implement well tried and true practice design principles in VR. Yep. I don't understand how it could not work. like you're basically just taking what we know already and putting it in a different.
It's a moot point. It's not does VR work. It's does training work, does perception action coupling work, and repeated action coupling, or whatever it is you're trying to do. You're 100% right. And if you've preserved the perception action loop, if you've got behavioral realism, that you behave in the virtual simulation as you do in the real world, or as close to it, then all you're doing is giving mental reps. You're given those opportunities to practice. If people buy into mental imagery, how can you not buy into VR, where you're doing more than mental imagery? You're actually doing something rather than imagining doing something. So that's sometimes what flabbergasts me. So I think it's the wrong question, does VR work? It's back to content. They often said in Hollywood, content is king or queen, I would like to say. But there you've got, it is about the content, and back to the questions. What are you trying to do with it that you can't do in real life? Yeah. And it could be because it's expensive. It could be because it's risky. It could be because somebody could die if they make a mistake in real life. So these are the very important things, I think, to articulate. So there's a huge communication piece, Rob, and I've been learning this as well. As scientists, we get bogged down, and people have said to me, Kathy, people don't give a damn about the science, but you have to communicate. What are those principles? Where's the added value?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And, looping it into like what's going on in the world now, the reason we want kids to learn statistics and people to learn math is so they can be critical consumers, right? Yeah. So that's part of my goal here, is for people in sports to be critical consumer of technology, right? There's lots of flashy looking stuff out there, but ask why and what is it for? What is it doing? And you lose a lot of it will fall to the side.
Yeah,
this kind of snake oil. But.
Totally agree. The snake oil. I mean, I've seen a lot of it, and as I said, this was my motivation to do what I'm doing. Is I see too many charlatans out there. I see too many false promises and false claims, and it really bugs me. So I think what we're trying. Well, I like to think what I'm trying to do is built on 20 years solid research, where I haven't just shown it in one sport, one task. It consistently is. Why? Because there's a strong theoretical principle behind it all, and it's those solid foundational questions that underpin everything that I do. Yeah,
and I appreciate your efforts too, Sam. You guys, I can point to all my rambling thoughts over the years about psychological fidelity and physical fidelity. I just say read that. So that helps a lot. Yeah. So thank you both very much. I'm going to end the live broadcast here. Thank you everyone for joining us and the question we had.
Yeah.
Okay.